Hi.
Hi.
Welcome to Coffee and Crime, everyone. I'm Stephanie, the Adult Programming Coordinator, and today we have Emma Copley,
Copley. Yeah, like a Copley.
That's right. And we're going to be discussing her book, The Third Rainbow Girl. Before we get into that, I did want to say, oh, there we go. There's the book. Since we are virtual, we have no coffee to go with our crime. So we're giving away a gift certificate to Ninja Warrior Coffee House. It's a random draw for questions. So we're going to let Emma talk about the book, and then we have questions. And so please ask your questions in the comment section, and we'll get to them at the end. And you could win some coffee.
Very cool. Thank you. Okay, great. Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me. Love to support the public library system. Wonderful. And yeah, I'm going to be reading a section of, it's backwards on my screen, this book, The Third Rainbow Girl. I think I'll read to you from the very beginning, which will give a sense of what the crime is and what happened. And then I'll kind of skip further ahead to thinking about this question of biases and how people's preconceived notions really affected this case and created some pretty tragic ramifications. So it'll be a little bit of a journey. All right, so the book is just, I guess, for warning, definitely, obviously dark. You're here, you know, it's about crime, but also there are some elements of me and the contemporary Pocahontas County, West Virginia section. So if you see and hear some stuff that's not exactly crime, don't be alarmed. All right, called True Things. Here are some true things. 1. In the afternoon or early evening of June 25th, 1980, Vicki Durian and Nancy Santamero were killed in an isolated clearing in southeastern West Virginia. They were 26 and 19, hitchhiking to an outdoor peace festival known as the Rainbow Gathering. But as the result of 2 and 3 close-range gunshot wounds, respectively, they never arrived. Vicki was from Iowa, but was working as a home health aide in Arizona. Nancy had dropped out of college in New York and was working at a Tucson thrift store. They had not had sex on the day they died, nor were they raped. Their killings have been called the Rainbow Murders. 2. They died in Pocahontas County, a sparsely populated area that consists largely of protected national forest and sits along West Virginia's eastern border with Virginia. At the time of their murders, thousands of travelers from all over the country had come to this area to attend the Rainbow Gathering. Local reaction to the festival varied widely. Some Pocahontas Countyans were upset at the disruption of their lives and, assisted by prominent state politicians, filed an unsuccessful injunction to stop the event. Some speculated a causal link between the festival and the deaths. Because of this, as well as the remoteness of the clearing where the 2 women were found, citizens and law enforcement mostly believed that the killer was local. 3. The murders were a trauma experienced on a community scale. Wherever they went to eat or relax or pray, residents discussed these crimes and the fact that the killer was likely still living among them. 2 young women, 2 young women had come to their home place for a peaceful celebration and instead ended up dead. Hillsborough, the closest town, held less than 300 people. Neighbor accused neighbor. 4. No one was prosecuted for Vicki and Nancy's murders for 13 years. Eventually, 9 local people were arrested and charged with crimes connected to the killings. 3 more were named as suspects by law enforcement. 2 confessed. 4 accused another in sworn statements or testimony. All this and more was reported in great detail by the local paper, the Pocahontas Times, each Thursday morning. The accused were all men who made their living by working the land, farming, hauling timber, cutting locust posts, or baling hay. 5. In 1993, the state of West Virginia chose to pursue a trial against one man only, a local farmer named Jacob Beard, whom it deemed the, quote, trigger man. Beard was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The state's case rested on the word of 2 of the 9 men. Both offered immunity in exchange for their testimony. 3 men, prosecution witnesses testified, had picked up Vicki and Nancy hitchhiking and then driven them to the woods where the other men joined the party. The men drank and smoked weed, the prosecution's theory continued, and then they tried to assault Vicky and Nancy. When the women struggled too much and threatened to go to the police, Beard was said to have shot them. One of the witnesses had less than a third-grade education, and the other said he had repressed his memories of the murders for many years, but later recovered them. Both witnesses were physically assaulted as well by West Virginia state police officers. 6. In 1984, a man named Joseph Paul Franklin, already incarcerated in a federal prison in Illinois for a series of murders he had committed throughout the late 1970s and early 80s, told an investigator that he shot and killed 2 women in the woods of West Virginia. Franklin had a tendency to make claims that he would later disavow, and he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Law enforcement deemed his confession less than platinum, and the judge in Beard's case agreed. But in 1996, after learning that Beard was doing what Franklin felt to be his time, Franklin grew more insistent in claiming responsibility for Vicky and Nancy's deaths. With Franklin's cooperation, Beard was granted a new trial in 1999 and found not guilty in 2000. 7. I lived in Pocahontas County, West Virginia from May 2009 to November 2010, and have spent approximately 200 additional nights here, mostly in summer. I came as a volunteer in Service to America, a corps of domestic service volunteers created in 1965 to, quote, alleviate poverty in America's most distressed regions that sits under the broader program AmeriCorps. It was my job to empower the teenage girls of southeastern West Virginia by fostering their academic excellence, their knowledge of the ecology and history of their home state, and their healthy emotional development. I eventually moved away from Pocahontas County, but have since been back many times as a friend and worker, and later as a reporter. That troubled and troubling term, because once I heard the story of Vicky and Nancy and the 9 men, it would not leave me. The idea of Appalachia is well understood, the real place less so. It is a borderland, not truly of the South or of the North, and West Virginia is the only state entirely within its bounds. Because of its enormous natural resources and their subsequent extraction, which has largely profited corporations based elsewhere, the relationship between the people of West Virginia and the broader United States is sometimes compared to that between a colonized people and their colonizers. 10. If every woman is a non-consensual researcher looking into the word misogyny, then my most painful and powerful work was done in Pocahontas County. It could have been done in any other place because misogyny is in the groundwater of every American city and every American town, but for me, it was done here. Looking into the rainbow murders became part of this work. 11. According to the most recent FBI data, 74% of women who are murdered by men. In 84% of cases, the act of murder was not related to any commission of another felony, such as rape or robbery. In America, protecting or avenging white women from a violation of their safety or sexual autonomy has been used time and time again to justify the unlawful incarceration of men, particularly poor men and men of color. To be conceptualized or to conceptualize oneself as a victim, as my friend, the writer Sarah Marshall often reminds me, is the thing more than any other that inhibits personal and moral growth. White men accounted for nearly 80% of suicide deaths in 2017, and men in West Virginia are committing suicide at a rate of almost 3 times the national average, according to the most recent comprehensive data by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. These numbers further do not take into account deaths by drug overdose, car accident, or workplace accident. Last, Elizabeth Jondro hitchhiked with Vicky and Nancy across the United States. In the mythology of these events, Liz is known as the third Rainbow Girl, though she did not die. She's not a girl anymore, but a woman with a son and a rich network of love. When I think of all this as a story, I think of her. That's the beginning. Very, very complicated crime. And essentially, the whole middle part of the book explores, why the law enforcement officers felt that this case had to have been done by someone who was local. A big part of it, again, was because these 2 women were found in such a very rural and isolated place. But again, there was this other man from elsewhere, Franklin, who was indeed an already convicted multiple murderer, and he did confess to these crimes, and he was not believed by the West Virginia state police. So I'm going to read a little bit about that through the perspective of the person who kind of took up the cause for saying, actually, I think this wasn't done by a local person. I think this really was done by the serial killer. So her name is Debbie DeFalco, and she was with the West Virginia State Police. She was actually only the second woman ever to serve with the West Virginia State Police. Deborah DeFalco, Debbie, as she sent her emails to me, was waiting for me outside a Starbucks at the end of a brightly lit shopping plaza in a suburb of Washington, D.C. Her frappuccino was half empty before her on the slatted iron table, and she was older than I expected her to be, softer and more blurred, in a blue rain jacket and jeans. I understood her neck and her shoulders before I understood her face. Dark eyes, dark eyebrows, dark thick hair past her shirt collar that looked as if it had been straightened today or recently and then frizzed. It was going to storm. I'd promised not to make her late for her daughter's basketball game, where she was the coach. There's no doubt in my mind that Franklin did it, DeFalco told me bluntly. I'd like to have what she has, no doubt. I told her about my sense of being caught between two stories, each with their believers. I asked her how she could be so sure. Emma, she said, there was no evidence that ever pointed to Jake Beard. That's the bottom line. Whereas when it came to Franklin, the evidence matched. She rejected the idea that Franklin might have read about the case in newspapers or a true crime magazine, as Alkire and Wyford, who are the detective and the prosecutor in West Virginia, have alleged over the years. I had spent hours myself on this line of thinking, even engaging the services of a professional archival researcher and research librarian to try to find a detailed article on the Rainbow murders published before Franklin first confessed in 1984, but to no result. He could not have read about it, DeFalco said. Everyone always says, oh, he read that, but where, I would like to know. He was locked up right after the murders. She also disputed the notion that the police made details of the crimes available to the public and that his story changed over time. Every agency that interviewed him, the Wisconsin State Police, the Illinois State Police, the FBI, believed him, she reminded me, except for the West Virginia State Police. I didn't know Alkire, the detective, I said, but I knew Wyford, the prosecutor, a little, and I believed he was a good person. If Wyford was good, how did he go so wrong? You can't put blinders on, DeFalco said. You can't believe one thing absolutely. The wind picked up, and the umbrella in the middle of our metal table threatened to take off. Emma, she said again, show me some evidence against Jake Beard. Well, I offered there are the eyewitnesses and also all the citizens who gave testimony about that day. Why would they lie? They were talked to so many times, she said. When you're talked to so many times, you develop a story. You develop a story with the police who talk to you. Beard simply made a mistake, albeit a big mistake, she said, in calling one of the victim's fathers. Beard made a lot of mistakes, I said. DeFalco dipped her head, agreeing. After Beard's conviction, DeFalco said she was trying to help the Beard family. She says that Beard seemed like a normal guy with a family. He didn't creep her out. I was a police officer, she says. I took that serious. An innocent man was sitting in jail. After his conviction was overturned, she went out to coffee with Beard. I said to him, nothing can happen now. You can't be retried. So did you do it? Did you kill those girls? And he said, Debbie, I absolutely did not. And you believed him? It is one of the things I have prized in myself over the years, DeFalco said. I have developed a way of knowing people, of judging their character. And what's the motive? If it were Beard, what would be the motive? No motive, I conceded. I asked if she had other cases before where there was no motive. Never, she said. There is always a motive. Franklin had the motive, he had the means, and he had the opportunity. DeFalco said that Alkire had insisted over and over that it had to be somebody local, that people just don't come through Pocahontas County. Well, they do, she says. Further, the case had divided the state police officer against officer, she told me. People were on one side of it, the Beard side, or they were on the other side of it, the Franklin side. If I really wanted to know how much the state police was split, DeFalco said, I should talk to Michael Jordan, that's his real name, who served with her.
Yeah, that threw me off, I will say.
Yeah, it's just what he's named. Oh my. Okay, then she says, then she rose and wished me luck. She looked toward her silver Toyota minivan, an older model, but well kept. The traffic here, she said. I never wanted to end up in a place like this. I looked back at the index of witnesses for Beard's trial and found him, as Wyford noted, testifying for the defense. Corporal Michael Jordan, his real name, I called him. He spoke well of Alkire, the mean detective, which surprised me. called him Bob, and seemed to feel the loss of their friendship acutely. I've had no contact with Bob whatsoever since the early 90s, Jordan said into his landline phone and then his cell phone on his way to work security with the college near his home in Elkins, West Virginia. When this case kind of blew up, I went my way and Bob went his. In the mid-1980s, Jordan worked in the plainclothes division of the West Virginia State Police out of Elkins. His boss was Alkire. This was during the time when Alkire had been assigned away from the Rainbow murders in order to pursue other cases, but had, according to Jordan, never truly stepped away. Jordan, alongside DeFalco, worked under Alkire in the Major Crimes Division, and their load was mostly drug cases. They were discouraged from socializing with the officers in uniform, so they often hung out with each other, dinners and picnics and the 4th of July. Everybody got along, Jordan said. The wives got along well, the men got along well. It was kind of like a little clique. The ladies would cook, the men would play cards, smoke cigars, do what guys do. Jordan described Alkire as a mellow, even-tempered officer and boss who didn't micromanage and always signed off on Jordan's investigation reports and receipts with a joke or two. Jordan's then wife was close with Elaine Alkire, and Jordan watched Alkire be a caring and present father to his 2 sons. Sometimes when there is a significant crime, such as a murder that wouldn't solve, detectives from their 12-county area could request major crimes officers to come in and assist. That's how I got involved in the Jake Beard aspect of the case, says Jordan. In the hallways and over the coffee pot, officers told each other that Alkire was holding steadfastly to the idea that local people had killed Vicky and Nancy. Alkire got a promotion in the late 1980s to sergeant and then first sergeant, and took a transfer back to Pocahontas County. One day in the early 90s, after they had all already arrested the relevant necessary people, that's this group of 9 men, Jordan said, Bob came to me and said he wanted me to help him put this case together. When we sat down initially, the Franklin issue came up, and I said, what are you going to do about this? It's discoverable. Someone else has confessed. I mean, you know it's going to come up. And he said, we're going to investigate this case to the fullest, and if Franklin did it, then Franklin did it. If you want to look at the Franklin aspect of it, it's fine. And he gave me full leeway to do that, and I did. Jordan retread much of what DeFalco had already done in the early 1980s and was involved in many of the actions in 1992. He reported on his work daily to Alkire. To me, the further the case went, the more the Jake Beard aspect of the case fell apart. And the further the case went, the stronger to me it looked like Joseph Paul Franklin had committed the crime, Jordan said. He was persuaded by the sum of the facts in support of Franklin's guilt, plus simply that Franklin was an established killer with a modus operandi and Beard was not. I think Jake is a wannabe detective, says Jordan. I think he wanted to be the hero of the case and crack the case. He has an ego thing going. I think he wanted to be some sort of local hero. In contrast, Jordan said, Franklin is a psychopath. I get that part. Not everything that comes out of his mouth is truthful. But when you look at Jake Beard, you take a man that has no real criminal history to brutally murder 2 girls in cold blood and not just kill them, but shoot them to pieces for apparently nothing. Then you have Franklin, who has all kinds of issues and upwards of 30 confirmed kills. And I mean, just that within itself. I believe Alkire is sincere in his belief in the Beard theory, but I personally don't see it, and I didn't at the time, and I made that known. Skip ahead just a little bit. Okay. So basically, many things unravel. There is much additional investigation that causes Jordan to believe again that this is probably Franklin is the guilty party. And that was the last contact I had on the Rainbow case, Jordan said. So did they say to you, thank you very much for looking into this Franklin aspect? You're no longer assigned to this case? They didn't say thank you very much, no, Jordan laughed. They said they were going to continue to investigate the case against Jacob Beard, but I was not going to be involved in it. Did you feel that you were a whistleblower and they were mad at you for having spoken up? Very much so, he said. I told Jordan I couldn't believe that any person, and definitely not Alkire, who made wooden benches and had retired to be a woodworker, was a friend and card player to Jordan, meant to put an innocent man in prison for 6 years. Jordan didn't either. I don't think Alkire was that type of person to get violent. I don't think he was that type of person in this case. He's a good person. To me, good people make mistakes. I do it every day. I am a good person, but I make mistakes. I think with this case, it got personal. Everybody wants to protect their beliefs and their interests. I believe that Bob will go to his grave believing that he had the right person. I wondered aloud what made Alkire so convinced of Beard's guilt. Did he give Jordan any sense of that, or any sense of why he truly couldn't believe that Franklin might have done it? Jordan went silent on the phone for the first time. No, he said after a time. He felt like they still had a provable case, like they had the right guy. Sometimes police are just like anybody else. They get blinders on. They get tunnel vision. I'm not accusing him of that. I'm just saying that sometimes I probably did it at some point with Franklin. My belief was that he committed the crime, and maybe I began not to be able to see the beard theory any longer. I don't have any evidence of Franklin's guilt. I don't think there will ever be any evidence of that. Jordan continued, I'm not saying he's a perfect witness. I'm just saying compared to the Jacob Beard aspect, I thought there was a lot less holes in the Franklin stuff than there was with the Jacob Beard stuff. We want the story to be perfect, I noted. And the minute it's not perfect, we're like, it's a lie. Exactly. I think I'll stop there.
It was a very, I mean, as many years took place from the time that the murders happened until anything even happened to start with.
Yeah.
On this book, what made you want to tell this story? I mean, I know you lived in Pocahontas, but what made you want to tell this story?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I lived in Pocahontas County, and I found out about these crimes just through friends. I was, living there, making friends, having relationships, and I went to this writing group. It's always the thing inside, I guess. Went to a writing group. We were all sharing some nice writing about like trees and nature and stuff. And this one man who was the dad of someone I knew pretty well at that point shared a poem about finding these two dead bodies, and then started to cry. And at first I thought that it was some like powerful image that I don't know had been conjured, but no, he was actually the person who had found Vicky and Nancy's bodies in 1980, and it was just clear like how much that event was still with him and was still really haunting him. And I think the more I learned about the guys that I spent time with in the community, as well as the young women I was there supposedly to serve and be with, it seemed that many of those young men were kind of the next generation, in many ways, sons or nephews or students of many of the men who had been involved or accused of the Rainbow murders, and that kind of story, or the sense that they were bad or something bad had happened there and it was the community's fault, I think was very much still present. And I just, everything that was available online about the case was extremely flat and false, I felt, and very disrespectful to the people in the community. And I didn't necessarily know if I could do any better, but it felt like it was just such a glaring, I was like, there has to be more than that.
More.
Yeah.
The people there are more dimensional than that.
Yeah. I mean, I knew that from being there. And so I was just like, well, if they're going to portray the people like this, why should I trust this version of events as well? So I just kind of started, you put a toe in and follow the story. And 7 years later, here we are. Yeah.
Well, as far as the bias of the initial prosecution of Beard, you had mentioned it all started just because he called the victims' parents.
Yeah.
And did he? That is suspicious. I mean, like it just is. I mean, that's what they say on all crime shows is, if somebody's paying attention too much, if they're lurking, there's probably a reason, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they did it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, absolutely, it's suspicious. And I think, what Beard said, I did interview him for the book, and what he basically said was like, I couldn't get any peace about it. Like I read about it and it really disturbed me. And I was worried that it wasn't getting, the full investigation that it deserved. It had been a long time at that point. He made that call, I think it was like 8 years later. And there was a sense that, he felt responsible in some way for making sure this crime got solved, which a part of me doesn't believe and is a bit more persuaded by the Michael Jordan's theory that like he just was kind of on a power trip and wanted to insert himself into something that was exciting or that was a community drama. And then another part of me is like, I kind of maybe do believe that a little bit in the sense that, again, I think the more I learned about this crime, the more I felt like people said, you know, it affected everyone in this community. It was impossible to avoid it. And that there was a sense that, you know, people were, you know, from the outside were looking again at Pocahontas County and at West Virginia and being like, you know, these hicks can't even solve this crime. And it was this the fact that it couldn't be solved and then its investigation and the ways that the investigation went, you know, potentially so awry is part of what makes the case so painful. So I don't know.
And it could even be just when you are in a community in which they all were saying it had to be somebody local. It had to be somebody local. And if you keep saying it enough, you the local people that are on that hit list of possibilities, they start to like look at themselves and each other and go, would we have done something like this?
Yeah.
Like, you know,
Totally.
do you think that they kind of just, because if he did not do it, then you also had the other men who said that he did it and they saw him do it.
Totally.
I mean, coerced, beaten, you know, and we've seen that with many small town agencies sometimes. But they did say that he did it and it went through the trial. But again, it also what was so early that we don't have the kind of forensics that we rely on these days to really kind of narrow it down.
I think, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that that's part of the thing is that there's only eyewitness testimony. There's only people telling the story in this case. And that is part of what I wanted to look at in this book is indeed like what happens when a story is told so many times that it becomes the kind of story of you or of your community. It takes on this like larger aspect, I think. And I don't know if this resonates. I don't know that much about South Carolina's history, and it's super different from West Virginia, of course. But I think that what I learned or what I read about and thinking about like the broader context of this crime is that I don't think it's possible to grow up in West Virginia without absorbing a larger story about the place, which is one, you know, mainstream America views Appalachia and more specifically perhaps West Virginia with such incredible disgust and disdain, mostly. That's the story that you get as a young person growing up there. So I think that there was perhaps, especially for men who were the ones sort of accused in this moment and also working on their own stuff around women and feelings about women, that they felt like, indeed, maybe I did do this sort of, and like I'm implicated in this somehow. And I think there was not only the men who said that Beard had done it, but there were many other men who also confessed to this crime. And, you know, there's one guy named Gerald Brown who's always really interesting to me because, you know, basically he said several times that he thought maybe I did it, but maybe I was just really drunk and don't remember doing it. And it was kind of the sense of like, I wouldn't, like, it was no big deal or something, like maybe I accidentally like murdered someone. I don't really know, you know, and I felt like that was so fascinating because, you know, he was a tough guy, like he was a logger and stuff, but there was never any evidence that he was a violent person or that he had committed any crime. And I think that comes from, in some ways, a desire to tell a story about oneself, of me being tough and scary. And to some extent, it was a story of other people, you know, saying, I think you did this, like, try to remember, and maybe you did do this. And he was like, maybe I did. Like, there is a way that one's own shame and I think fear of oneself and maybe fear of one's own masculinity and what one's capable of can then kind of mix with cultural stories about men, and particularly like Appalachian men or Southern men as being scary.
And alcohol added in.
Yeah, and with alcohol.
They all seem to be heavy. I mean, that's just.
Yeah, it's true. I think, you know, addiction is everywhere. It's in many families.
Yeah.
my family, but I think indeed, like in this particular regard, like alcohol certainly didn't help, and it didn't help the question of memory and accountability, and so it became very tangled with what happened versus the story of what happened.
Right. Because I've had nights that are hazy, and or that the friends had to tell you about. So it's kind of playing on that, would shooting a couple people accidentally have fallen into my, I didn't realize how I drove home, but not necessarily the same. But
it's just such a ridiculous thing too, though, because I feel like, again, it's worth saying that there was never any motive offered for why people would have done it. Like, there was this vague motive of like they were involved with the Rainbow murders, and maybe local people didn't like that or something.
Yeah.
Because people were coming in from elsewhere, perhaps. And then there was this sort of like vague sex reason that was like they wanted to have
but they didn't.
No, there was no evidence of that at all. And so,
and I honestly feel like if it does lean more towards, in my opinion, what that's worth, that it would have been the Franklin who was so disgusted and didn't like mixing races and all of that stuff, his mind frame, versus the country boys that just wanted to have fun and picked up two girls hanging out. It feels like it would have, if it went down a bad path, I would have thought that rape would have been involved as well. I mean, I just do. And that's a weird, horrible thing to say, but I guess when discussing true crime, you really can't get away from that. But I mean,
it's real, and that's why I put, in the first paragraph, like they weren't sexually assaulted, and because I think that's often like just vaguely assumed. Like whenever a woman is murdered, you're like, oh, it must have been a rape murder, and it's like, no, that's really not how a lot of murders happen. Like murders are crimes of power often, and that these crimes can be so random. Like, indeed, I think the idea that these like country fellows, like random fellows who don't know these women, would kill them for kind of no reason except for it just really plays on our own story of like men in the woods are scary and bad and will kill people and are irrational. Whereas like we actually have this white supremacist like multiple murderer who his life's work was to commit these crimes. So why are we more willing to believe this kind of offensive story about West Virginians versus, someone who's actually quite mentally ill and did these crimes quite often,
Right. So. Right. And I did appreciate the information given, because often, even though people do commit atrocities, there were atrocities committed to them. They grew up in something that, gave that groundwork of hatred and put them down that path. So like, even though Franklin is a horrible man who did horrible, horrible things, you still, you saw the trajectory and how it got there, the hate that just fed and fanned throughout his life.
I cried. Yeah. And he's, one thing I didn't expect about this book is that, of course, people don't just pop up and be of service in exact moments that you're interested in them. They live whole lives and do lots of things before and after. So I didn't expect to actually end up connecting with and speaking with, like basically a survivor of one of these other crimes that he committed in Salt Lake City in Utah, and the way that she, Terry, she ended up kind of forgiving Franklin and having empathy for him. And that was something I think that made me have more empathy for him too, that she kind of showed me. She told me that he basically said, when he was about to die, to be executed by the state of Illinois, he was like, I wish that people who are involved in white supremacy now, like he was watching the kind of rise of white supremacy that we're seeing now before he died. And he was like, I wish that they would know how much they're ruining their life to get involved in that. And that this is, he basically was able to see I was so ill and what I did was so wrong. And I think that made me have a bit more empathy for him too.
Yeah. I was pretty blown away by her just in general.
Right? I know.
Yeah, she's a
pretty person.
And that I was also kind of just an aside. the third Rainbow Girl, that she did end up going after that. She didn't put the murders of her two compatriots with the gatherings, and she continued going for many, many years.
I know.
Post. I can't imagine, because I can't imagine, and I don't want to imagine myself in that spot, but I can't imagine not associating the two things. I don't know that I would have been able to go back.
I know. I just find that so indicative of her like more general worldview, which is sort of one that embraces uncertainty and things having some kind of meaning, even if it seems extremely meaningless at the time. And indeed, that she was like, I went to, I'm forgetting the exact number, I think it was like 7 or 8 additional rainbow gatherings after her friends were killed at the one in West Virginia. And I believe her son was conceived at a rainbow gathering, she said. And so that there's a kind of strange like life coming from this darkness that I feel like was kind of present in a lot of the people I spoke to in this book. Like, it's a book about murder, and it's also a book about, I think, resilience and people trying to find connection and grieving the loss and trying to figure out how to not pass on so many of these harmful, traumatic incidents to their kids and the next generation and stuff. I fought really hard to have some light on the cover. Like, it's you have some darkness, but I was like, I really need some yellow coming in there or something. Because at first they wanted to give me like a very sad, like Appalachian house. And I was like, no, like that's not, that makes me sad. And it's not a good representation of these events, because this is more complicated than just being pure darkness, I think.
And don't forget, anybody who's watching, ask questions in the comment section. This one kind of is a little bit focused on what you're saying. Beth wants to know, a lot of criticism around true crime genre is it focuses on the inherent risk of exploiting victims. How do you feel like your unique approach to the genre minimizes that risk?
Yeah, I thought a lot about that. I don't know that I did a perfect job, and I don't know that anyone does or can be completely avoided. But I think what I thought about and I tried to put into the book was a sense that I wanted to make Vicki and Nancy, the women who were killed, feel like real people, like that they are not just like dead bodies, like on the page 1, or oftentimes like when you watch like Law and Order SVU, it's like the first few minutes are just looking at a brutalized body of a woman, usually a white woman, and I wanted to really push back against that trope, I think, and think about how to kind of ask myself, like, well, who were they and what were they doing in their lives, and what brought them to hitchhike across country and come to this festival. And I think there was a lot of like sexism and misogyny at play in the newspaper coverage of these crimes, because they were often like, well, what did these women expect? Like, they were hitchhiking by themselves. And it's like, well, people leave the house all the time. People go on the road all the time for all kinds of complicated reasons, including trying to change their lives, including just wanting to go on an adventure. Like, men get to just go on an adventure. Why can't women too, without this kind of sense of, well, you were asking for it or you did something wrong?
Yeah.
And I think so. I spent a lot of time with both of their families. Generously, Vicki's family hosted me in Iowa for like 2 or 3 days, and same with Nancy's family in Long Island. It was a little bit shorter, but they both spoke really openly with me, which was really appreciated. And I think one thing that really changed my perspective was that Vicki's brother shared that she had this child shortly before she started hitchhiking, and that she still figuring out a lot of her feelings of loss about that, because sort of like what happened with Joni Mitchell, a lot of women gave up their kids kind of unwillingly in the end of the 60s, right before abortion was legalized. They would have had more choices a few years later. And so Vicki was like struggling with that a lot. And so understanding more about who she was and maybe some of the grief that she had gone through about her child really helped me to understand her as a real person. So I tried to put that in the book and make them complicated. Yeah.
Which is what people are.
Yeah.
Exactly. Definitely.
Yeah.
So you from the beginning to the end, you do now believe 100% as well that Franklin is, or is there a sliver that's in there?
Stephanie, I can't ever say anything 100%. I feel like
Okay.
that's unfortunately like
Yeah.
a big part of this book. So if you're someone who's like, I must know the absolute answer, this might be video. But I just feel like part of what I learned about the book is like there's always going to be convincing. There's two stories. Like there's always going to be two convincing stories. For me, I'm more convinced by one of them than the other, but I'm also not from the place, and perhaps there are things that I don't know still that would be more convincing for someone who's from Pocahontas County. I feel like that interview with Debbie that I read tonight was probably the thing that convinced me the most, just because I have a lot of like trust in her, and I think she's really an accomplished and smart person and didn't have kind of the same personal stake in the investigation that some other people did. But the world is shifty and unknown, and we'll never know for sure.
No.
Yeah.
But no, I agree. The discussion with Debbie, definitely, just because her knowledge of law enforcement and crimes, and her background added to her knowing the facts of the case makes me go, okay,
Yeah, I think so.
I can see, I can see it. I believe you.
Totally.
What did you find the most challenging thing about writing this book? Just out of
so many things. I probably dreamed about murder, like murdering or being murdered every night for like 2 years, I would say. So that was difficult personally. And you just kind of get into this space, like if you read a lot of these books, but I think I was also just really dwelling in like the raw material of like there's just so much more that didn't go into the book that was also super difficult material to sit with. And I had a good therapist and
leaned heavily, right?
Heavily on the therapist, which I would recommend to anyone doing similar work. I think all law enforcement people should have a therapist. But I think the aspect of just like sitting with all of that information and trying to think about like just how to be a person and still want to go on living in the world, like after seeing all of these difficult and sad moments, and not just the violence, the actual murders, but just so much of the suffering that the families went through. And again, this idea
it wasn't just the two people who died. It was
it's
a little bit of the community itself.
Exactly. It ripples out. And also that there were so many of the men who were accused of these crimes or maybe even confessed to it, they were incarcerated for periods between like 2 months and almost a year, and that's not nothing. Like they basically couldn't get out because they didn't have money. It's the same cash bail system that keeps a lot of people incarcerated today. And so knowing, and hearing from their families, like this is all the things that they missed, because they were sitting in jail for this crime that so many people desperately wanted to solve, but their family member may or may not have been involved in, was pretty devastating too. And so there's just a lot of loss in the community as a result of this and as a result of the investigation. So just seeing all those ripples of trauma was hard to sit with, but we made it out the other side. Yeah.
Maura wanted to know, as an outsider in the area, asking about such a big topic from the community's past, did you feel like you faced a similar sort of criticism as the Rainbow Girls?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good one. I yes and no. I guess yes, in the sense that I'm definitely not from the area. I again just won't ever have the that sense of being in the family. But I also was just extremely. It's tricky because I lived there before, just as a person. So I lived in the community for about 2 years and had friends and relationships and work colleagues and people I saw at the grocery store and like all of those kind of informal social connections that in some ways made writing a book easier and in some ways made it harder because it also created a level of, I wanted to be extra sure to not, bring someone in a way that would feel compromising for them or in a way that would it's a very complicated crime in the community. So asking people to help or asking people to introduce me to other folks was always at somewhat of a potential cost just to their own personal lives. And so I tried to be always balancing that. I think when I was reading about the Rainbow Girls, though, and the Rainbow Festival and the way that local Pocahontas County folks are reacting to this idea of outsiders coming in or invading or some way, I didn't really feel any of that. I didn't feel like I was being told, you're different, so go away. If anything, I felt extremely welcomed and taken into a family, during the time I lived there. I think that certainly there's been really valid and important critiques and questions from people in the community who I don't necessarily know, or since the book has come out, of yeah, you're not from here and you wrote about this. And I'm like, you're right. And I tried to be extremely transparent about that in the book, at the beginning and throughout. It's part of why the pieces about me are in there, to be I want to be very upfront that this is my experience, which is in some ways this kind of weird in between. I was a resident and then I was gone, and then I was a resident and then I was gone. And so it was cool to hear from a lot of people, though, that maybe you're from the county who I didn't know, or who are from West Virginia more broadly, or Appalachia more broadly, being we felt like you did a good job with the cultural context of what it means to be from West Virginia and the way that the history of the state informs a lot of these crimes, and that meant a lot to me. So extremely mixed, but definitely not that sense of go away, I don't think, in the same way.
Yeah, you weren't on the level of the Rainbow Gathering people.
That was a long time ago. I think people have really opened up, and the internet has been a huge part of that. And there's just so much more national and international connection available than maybe there was in the 80s.
Yeah, definitely. And just to kind of wrap, I don't know.
Yeah.
When you do write your next book, will it be a true crime or will it be something else?
Absolutely not. I'm interested in, of course, in these big questions that violence and crime can shed light on in our society. And I, will always be fascinated and honored by this case and the way that people trusted me to talk about it. It's certainly not something I went looking for. I wasn't I must write a true crime book, let me go find a story about this. It was something that really was from my life, something that I came into by accident and then felt more and more involved and obsessed with. But no, I'm a fiction writer by training. I always wrote fiction and short stories before I wrote this book. And so that's my next project, is a novel, and it's totally different. And I'm excited for that.
And before that, you're actually Third Rainbow Girl does go out in paperback starting in January, correct?
Yep, January 19th. She has a fun paperback makeover cover, which is features a West Virginia photographer named Roger May, who's really awesome. So yeah, it was cool to get to use actually an image from the region, which we didn't get to on the hardcover. So. Mm-hmm.
That's very cool. That's very cool. Did you just since you mentioned it, did you get a lot of input with that as far as getting to reach out to find a West Virginia art?
Yeah, I had fought really hard for it for the hardcover, and we did get a West Virginia artist to do the maps that are on the inside. That was really a fun thing that I fought for, and this is Liz Scanlon is her name, who did the maps inside, but I lost the battle on the cover for the hardcover.
But after your wonderful success of the book, we're you get it for the paper.
Yeah, I was like, why would we ever use a stock image when there are so many beautiful images of
exactly?
So yeah,
exactly. Well, I thank you so much for joining us tonight, and for those of you who've listened who might not have read it yet, we have copies to check out. Again, the book is going to be available it's available to purchase now, but if you want to also get the paperback copy, it comes out in January. And thank you so much, Emma, for joining us. We really did appreciate it. And I hope you all join us next time for Coffee and Crime. And I forgot, Maura, you are our winner for Coffee and Crime. You get the Ninja Warrior coffee gift card. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
Thank you.
Bye.